Hey, I see we have a few people already. It's not quite 6 o'clock, so we'll start in a minute. I think we have altogether 7 people in the class. So, now, of course, this is a synchronous, but since we're online, all the sessions will be recorded. And that way, if you can't be here for some reason, or if you miss something, you can watch the recording. When we're done, I'll be putting it in Brightspace. Um, in the past, that was always kind of a problem because, these records are very space intense, but Brightspace does seem to have plenty of room. Actually, let me get that open right now. All right, so let's get that going. All right, so here's the Brightspace for our class. And I made sure that it's open. They kept sending us emails reminding us, make sure that the class is open, because, the way it's set up so you can put materials on there, but you have to go through the formality of making it open. So it is open. You can go in there right now. And the majority of the material for this semester is already here. I've been posting it over the last week or so. And you can see that if you go through the list, we start with now the Mind tab. It's been kind of a pain. It is summertime, and in academia, a lot of people are away, and so this we'll discuss this in a second. But the Mind tab isn't quite ready yet. There's still one or two things that have to be done to get it ready. So the Mind tab, if you've never used it, it's an online learning management system, and so all of the assignments are in the Mind tab system. And as is the textbook. Okay, so when you sign up for MindTap, which we'll discuss, I hope at our next session on Thursday night, I'll show you how to get it set up and how to access the assignments and also how to access the textbook because it's all contained in the same package. So normally we would do this tonight, but unfortunately, because so many people were away, um, not everything was done on time, so we'll have to hold on to this until Thursday night. Although if it does suddenly become available, I'll send you an email, let you know. But basically, this is where we're going to find all the assignments and as well as the exams, by the way. Um, Everything's going to be done through this MindTap system. So if you've used it before, you know exactly what to expect. You go online, you've got a bunch of assignments, and then you do them online. It'll show you your answers. It'll correct them right on the spot for you. It's a very good system, but it has to be linked up correctly with the book and the school and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a few hurdles that we didn't quite get through yet. So we'll have this conversation again on Thursday night, how to get set up and get into the system so you can do your assignments. Now, if there's a delay of some kind, obviously the due dates will have to be adjusted, but my aim is to have some MindTap assignments due every week. I'm hoping that they won't be too overwhelmingly time consuming. I was very careful when I chose these assignments, but let's just run through the syllabus for a second while we're talking about this. If you look at it very carefully, you'll see that since we're only going to be meeting for roughly a month, we don't have that much time. So we're going to restrict ourselves to the MindTap assignments, which will be basically every week. We're also going to have periodically as Excel assignments, which I think is a really good idea because some of the concepts we'll be going over, would take a long time to do with a calculator. And also everybody in a business program will certainly benefit from learning more about Excel. And so we're going to have a handful of Excel assignments, which probably won't start for at least a few weeks because most of it takes place towards the end of the course. And then we'll have a single final exam at the end. So that's going to have to do it for the grades. So we do only have, I believe, 10 sessions spread over 5 weeks. So, we can't be wasting all of our time with exams, can we? So we'll go over this again later on. In the meantime, just want to mention a few things. Syllabus is posted on Brightspace. You can look at my information over here. We do meet on Tuesday and Thursday nights at 6 o'clock until 9:30 for 5 weeks, actually. Now, if you want to have office hours, if you want to ask questions or go over the material, it can be arranged. You just have to send me an email and let me know that you're interested, and then we'll figure out a time that we're both available, and then we can have our own private meeting on Zoom. Okay. We can't obviously do this in person, but it's still possible to arrange office hours online. And if all you need is something fairly quick, you can just send me an email. My information is right here, and Anderson at mville.edu. And so you can contact me that way. In a real emergency, there's a phone number here too, but I don't know if there's any real reason to use that. But yes, you can get in touch with me with emails. And so anyway, so every week we're going to meet this in this format. By the way, I did send out the link tonight, but if for some strange reason I forget to send it to you, if you go into Brightspace, you'll see that there's actually a separate folder with the links. And so there they are. So in other words, if you're like, oh God, I didn't receive my invitation, all you would have to do is come in here and click on the link and you'll be all set. Okay, so just be aware that these are here. I actually this is a really good idea, but the school I think is very happy to see this kind of thing because the last thing we need is for nobody to get their links. So that's why they're here. Okay, the syllabus, as you can see, is over here as well. It has now, by the way, we do have to make a small change to it. You may be aware that, of course, this is now Manhattanville University. So this is the older style heading. So we'll have to get that fixed. But basically, this is our syllabus. So you've got the book. And when we get MindTap set up, you'll have access to the electronic version of the book. It's Financial Markets and Institutions by Jeffrey Madura, very well-known writer in the field. I've used many of his books before. You can see here we've got the MindTap, which is published by Cengage. And also we're going to use Excel to a certain degree, especially towards the second half of the class, because like I said, a lot of the concepts we'll be getting to at that part of the course are very computationally intensive, and we don't want to have to spend time doing them by hand. All right, well, anyway, so with all that being said, what exactly will we be doing this semester? Well, we're going to cover a little bit of everything. This is the actual title of this course is Financial Institutions, Money and Markets, which means we're going to do some economics, we're going to do some finance, we're going to cover a lot of very interesting material, but let's take a quick look down here. We start with money market securities, we're going to look at bonds, and we're going to look at an introduction to other types of securities that trade in the marketplace. And we're going to discuss in very great detail how interest rates are determined in the economy. We're going to talk about the Federal Reserve System and how it carries out monetary policy. Let's see, what's next? They're going to look at the bond markets. Let's see. Then we're going to look at stock markets. We're going to understand how stocks are priced in the marketplace. We're going to look at some theoretical models. We're going to look at some institutional details about stock market trading and how we analyze the price of a stock. And there's quite a few different ways of going about that. So we'll be looking at some basic accounting data to help us understand how to determine the value of a corporation. Let's see, we also are going to introduce derivative securities, a very interesting area of study because these are used for hedging purposes, but they can also be used for speculation, and the trading volume in these markets is astronomical. We want to understand what they are, how they're used, and why they're so risky. In fact, you may have heard Warren Buffett referring to them as weapons of financial mass destruction, and that's because it's easy to use these things badly and lose a lot of money in a hurry. But if they're used wisely, they can be used to help us manage our risk much more efficiently than was ever possible before these securities became available in the marketplace. So we're going to wrap it up with our discussion about derivatives. And so we got a lot of ground to cover here. So now let's see, 1, 2, 3, still missing a few people. Let's see, what else should we go over? All right, I'll tell you what, why don't we just get started? Let's see, we're going to start with chapter 2. You can read chapter 1. I mean, we're going to start right here. This is where we start to talk about interest rates. Now, of course, interest rates are incredibly important because they determine the cost of borrowing for a corporation. They also help determine the rate of return to investors in the marketplace. So for example, if you're investing in bonds, then the level of interest rates in the economy is going to determine, for the most part, what kind of rates of return you can earn. But of course, from the perspective of the corporation, this is going to be a hugely important determinant of how much it costs to borrow money, which in turn will help us decide whether we should expand our operations, or maybe we should maybe try to take over another corporation or invest in new products. So what we want to do is take a deeper look at interest rates and try to understand exactly where they're coming from. I mean, we can observe interest rates in the economy very easily, but economists have studied interest rates for many, I guess, centuries to help us understand exactly what it is that's determining why they're so high at some points in time and why they're so low at other points in time. You might recall that, for example, during the COVID, interest rates were at historically low levels for quite a long time, as a matter of fact. In fact, if you want to see the level of interest rates in the economy, and we'll look at this later on anyway, but you can take a look at the U.S. Treasury Department's website. Take a look at the interest rates that are currently being paid on what are called Treasury securities. Um, Treasury securities are bonds issued by the U.S. government to borrow money. You know why they borrow the money. Now, private companies do this all the time, but they're doing this in order to raise funds to run their businesses. When the government borrows money, they only have one reason for doing this, and that's to cover their deficits. Okay. It's gotten to the point where, for all practical purposes, the idea that a government might actually have a surplus at the end of the year is beyond ridiculous. It's just a question of how much do they owe at the end of the year. So, I mean, in the US in particular, I mean, the amount that they have to borrow every year is it's close to like $1 trillion or more every year. And so the way they do that, they don't go to banks. They need way more money than the banks could lend them anyway. They issue these securities, which are called treasuries. Or treasuries, sometimes they're called treasury bills, treasury bonds, whatever. So the rates that they pay are available on this website, which the links, by the way, are in the slides. And so it gives you a sense of what the level of interest rates in the economy is right now. You can see, for example, as of May 1st, a 1-month Treasury bill was providing investors with a return of 4.38%. And then you can see these different time frames represent the maturity of these securities. So if I want to invest for the long term, I could buy a 30-year Treasury bond and earn a 4.74% rate of interest every year. So you're probably wondering, well, isn't that normal? And it is. These are interest rates that you would expect to see throughout U.S. history. But if you go back to the COVID days, you'll say, wait a minute. Of course, maybe you weren't paying such close attention to it back then, but if you go to 2020, you'll say, wait a minute, look at these numbers, 1.53, 1.50, well, what's going on here? In fact, it may have even been lower than that in 2021. Yes, look at these numbers. Now, these were unheard of. Okay. So, and we'll discuss monetary policy as we go along, but the idea here was that the Fed believed that the economy was in very deep trouble because of the COVID, and they decided that one of the best ways to keep the economy from collapsing was to keep interest rates at such low levels that banks could continue to make loans and businesses could continue to borrow. So you don't normally see levels like this unless something's going terribly, terribly wrong in the economy. These numbers are unheard of. I mean, throughout U.S. history, these were as low as they've been. So now, of course, once the COVID started to end, we saw rates being returned to much more normal levels, and that's where we are now. This is much more like what you used to see. I mean, there have been periods in history where rates have been higher than this. Usually that took place when inflation was unusually high, but this is about normal throughout U.S. history, these types of numbers. So the economy is more or less getting back on its feet, and the interest rates in the treasury market reflect that. So what we want to do is take a closer look at how interest rates are determined in the marketplace. Now, in order to do that, we're going to use the concept of supply and demand. Now, it's very likely that you've had some economics background in your travels, but if not, we'll just take a quick look at what supply and demand are all about, because ultimately what we're going to do here is determine interest rates in terms of the demand and the supply for what we call loanable funds. Okay, so first, let me take a little detour here and briefly revisit the concept of supply and demand in case it's been a while or in case you've never seen this before. Normally, supply and demand are applied to goods in the marketplace. Okay. But in principle, we could apply it to anything we want. So we start with having the price of a good on a vertical axis and the quantity on the horizontal axis. So this could be for anything you could imagine. It could be, for example, slices of pizza. So we have two curves going on here, the supply curve and the demand curve. Okay, so the supply curve represents, just add this here. Hold on one second, make it a little bigger. Supply curve represents the amount of a product that producers are willing to produce or to sell at every possible price. Okay, now it's basically a schedule. Think of it as again, with, let's say this is pizza. How much pizza are these pizzerias willing to produce at different prices? Now, clearly, the higher the price is, the more pizza they're going to be willing to sell because each slice is that much more profitable. So the supply curve is always upward sloping. The demand curve is coming from individuals. It represents the amount of product that consumers are willing to buy at every possible price. In other words, this one is downward sloping because clearly the more expensive the pizza is, the less pizza people will buy. If pizza gets very expensive, people will switch out to something else, like fried chicken maybe, or burgers, or whatever the case may be. So this demand curve is always downward sloping. Now, what really is important in this framework is where do they cross? Okay, there comes a point where the two are equal to each other. So we're using the notation QS for quantity supplied and QD for quantity demanded. So there's one point and one point only where the two exactly match. In other words, at that point, let's say the price of the slices is $4, and in the market, pizzerias sell 100 million slices in the entire country. So at that point, this is where everybody's happy, meaning that the sellers are willing to sell 100 million pizza slices for $4. Consumers are willing to buy for at a price of $4, 100 million slices. Anywhere else, there's an imbalance of some kind. Okay, so in other words, let's move this down here. Oh, I almost forgot to mention the most important thing. This point has a special name in economics. It's called the equilibrium point. E for equilibrium. Suggests that there's a balance of some kind between quantity supplied, quantity demanded. Okay. You see that word used all over the place, but in economics, it specifically refers to a situation where the amount that people are willing to buy matches the amount that the companies are willing to sell. Anywhere else, we do not have equilibrium. So, for example, let's say the price is not $4, but $5. Well, now people have a very powerful incentive to find something else to eat for lunch. So here you can see the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. And the difference between the two is referred to as a surplus. This means that the pizzerias will find at the end of the day that they haven't sold all the slices because the public sees them as being too expensive. Okay. Now, of course, the pizzerias are smart. They can see this happening and they'll realize, wait a minute, we're charging too much. They're going to cut the price and they'll continue to cut the price until they reach equilibrium. Okay. They'll say, wait a minute, why do we have so much pizza left at the end of the day? We must be charging too much. So they slowly lower the price. And when they're done, they find that they sell all the pizza that they produced, and that means we're at equilibrium. But if one day, what if they tried the opposite approach? They decide, let's try $3. Well, they find themselves running out of pizza. You swarm in the door to buy all the slices at $3 each, and before you know it, there wouldn't be any left. So this is referred to as a shortage. And that means we've got to do something about that too. So we raise the price because clearly people are willing to pay more for these slices of pizza. There's no point in charging $3 when people are willing to pay more. So the price will gradually rise. And there we go. We find ourselves pretty quickly right back in equilibrium. So in the marketplace, the producers are very alert to, situations like this. They want to make sure they're maximizing their profits. So if they see that there's a surplus or a shortage developing, they're going to change the price. In fact, this is why things go on sale in supermarkets. They've got too many cans of beans on the shelves. So what do? They put them on sale. Or if they can't keep enough tuna fish in the store, then they raise the price because they need to be constantly paying attention to what the consumers are telling them. And they know at the end of the day, if they have too much of a product or too little, and that is a signal that the price is not where it should be. So because this happens automatically, we say that this market is said to be self-correcting. As the equilibrium price automatically gravitates towards, the price automatically gravitates to its equilibrium level. Okay. Okay. And this is all because of the profit motive. I mean, you find countries where the government is in charge of everything, where the government is running the show, where they choose prices at random and they're not paying any attention to market signals, and you have usually shortages in those countries or black markets. But in a country like the United States, people are free to do whatever they want. And so the prices tend to gravitate back towards equilibrium. If not, the businesses will disappear. Okay, so this is the standard supply and demand framework. We use it all the time in economics, but here we're going to apply it to something that you might not expect, and that would be interest rates. So you're probably thinking, well, how can we apply supply and demand to interest rates? An interest rate is not a product, is it? It is not. Okay, so, but we can think of an interest rate can be thought of as the price of money. In other words, if I want to borrow money, this is what I have to pay. If I am willing to lend it out, this is how much I expect to earn from it. So in this context, borrowers are the lenders of what we call loanable funds, and lenders, which means people who save their money or invest, are the suppliers of what we're going to call loanable funds. Okay. So in other words, it's still a supply and demand setting. It's just that the people who are borrowing are the ones who are demanding funds. The people who are saving their money or investing it are lending out their money. And you know that, and we'll see this more in the slides, but yeah, banks are lending you the money. You're not borrowing money from other people, but ultimately you are, because when you go to the bank to borrow money to buy a car, for example, you're borrowing other investors' money. The bank doesn't have its own money there. When you go to the bank to borrow money for a car, they're lending you deposits from other customers. So ultimately, people are borrowing and lending among themselves. The banks are acting as an intermediary because it's much more efficient that way. I mean, can you imagine if you wanted to buy a car and you had to go around the street and say, hey, who wants to lend me money to buy a car? That's not going to work. Okay. But the banks are there to take care of this for you. And they, of course, collect some fees along the way. But that's what they're there for. They take the savings of all these small savers and now they lend them out to customers who need to borrow. And some of the difference in the interest rates is what goes into their pockets. Okay, so for example, they might pay you 2.5%, 3% for your savings, then they'll lend it out to somebody to buy a car for 8%. So the difference between those two numbers is going to, in principle, go into their pockets after paying for their own expenses. So the interest rates on the side where the bank is lending to you are determined by market conditions, but also by credit. Okay, you know how, for example, a car loan is a lot cheaper than credit cards. With a car, we have something called collateral. You buy a car, you drive it home, the bank lends you the money. If you don't make the car payments, the bank can just repossess your car. So there's collateral involved. They have real property that they can repossess if they have to. So that reduces their risk. With credit cards, you don't get that. If you can't pay your credit card bill, there's nothing for them to repossess. So they're going to have to charge you a lot more interest to compensate themselves for the risk that they're taking, lending you that money. So on that side of the fence, interest rates are heavily determined by credit conditions. And now some people, of course, have better credit than others, but still, there's always going to be discrepancies between the types of loans and how much you're actually paying. And it all ultimately comes down to credit. Now, anyway, with all that being said, we're going to introduce this loanable funds theory. And again, we're going to see that interest rates are going to be thought of as the result of the interaction between the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. And by the way, these supply and demand curves can shift around in the marketplace. If, for example, say one day we discover that pizza is actually healthy for you, let's say people realize, hey, wait a minute, we love pizza, and now they're telling us that it's healthy for us. The demand curve will actually shift to the right. We'll call this E1 and E2. And so the result of that will be that they're buying more pizza, but they're also paying a higher price for it. Okay. So in other words, people are saying we want more pizza and we're willing to pay more for it because, producing more pizza involves higher expenses for the producers. So if we expect them to sell us more pizzas, we have to be prepared to pay a higher price for it. So the same thing can happen in the marketplace. If people are if they're worried about the future, they may not want to borrow money, and then the demand for loanable funds can change as well. So, and the same thing can happen with the supply of the pizza. This, by the way, is known as an increase in demand. There's some external factor other than the price, which causes people to want more pizza. Health benefits, for example, if it turns out that tomatoes and cheese are actually even healthier than doctors realized before, well, people will use that as a sign that maybe we should have more pizza. Why not? Now, of course, it can go both ways. If they suddenly realize that pizza has a lot more calories than anyone realized, the demand curve will shift back in the other direction. They'll say, whoa, maybe we should try something different. Now, on the other hand, the suppliers may have, let's say it turns out that tomatoes are unusually plentiful this year, and so the cost of making pizza goes down. Well, the pizzerias will respond to that by selling more pizza. Oops, wrong way, sorry. Let me fix that. So in other words, the pizzerias are saying, listen, the tomatoes are cheaper this year than usual, so we can afford to sell more of the pizzas at a lower price. And so this would be an increase in supply. Of course, the reverse could happen too. There's unusually difficult year in the tomato market, let's say that in Italy the crops are ruined by tornadoes or something, then the cost of tomatoes goes up, supply goes to the left, and we're going to pay more for our pizzas. A similar thing has happened in recent years in the markets for vanilla and to a certain degree chocolate. Vanilla has gotten very, very expensive in recent years because of supply conditions the thing is about vanilla is it only grows well in a handful of countries in Western Africa. And if the weather's bad, we're going to pay a lot more money for our vanilla. If you're not a baker, you may not have noticed this, but vanilla has gotten horrendously expensive in recent years because of the weather in Africa. So what's happening is that the supply is being significantly reduced because of weather conditions. But anyway, with all that being said, let's get back to interest rates. So the demand for loanable funds is coming from people who want to borrow. Now, households borrow all the time. They borrow to buy cars, to buy houses, to fix their houses, to, anything to pay for college tuition. There's a million reasons for households to borrow money, okay, mainly for consumption purposes. Businesses are borrowing because they hope that it will enable them to increase their profits. In other words, they may want to expand their operations. They may want to develop new products. Like, for example, Apple, they must spend a fortune developing the new iPhone every year. And it's gotten to that point where they must have a new iPhone every year. The market expects it. And so their stock would fall through the floor if one year they said, we didn't have time to build a new one this year. So, but they must spend billions of dollars getting that ready. Where does it come from? Well, I mean, even Apple doesn't have billions of dollars of cash laying around. So they will probably issue bonds. Okay, we'll discuss bonds later on, but when they issue bonds, they're actually borrowing money from investors. And that's in order to produce the next version of iPhones, which they must have in order to keep their profits strong. Okay. In fact, already it's only May and people are already seeing hints in the press about what's happening with the newest iPhones that won't be ready until the fall. Then you'll see the day that they release the next one. There's that gigantic Apple store in Fifth Avenue. You've probably seen pictures of it, the glass cube. It's right by, it's very close to Bloomingdale's there. People stand in line on the night that the new one is released, and that store is never closed. So there will be people literally lined up around that block until that first day when the new version is released. The people who must have the new version immediately will be standing in that line all night if they have to. And then everybody else gradually gets theirs. But Apple knows what they're doing. Let's put it that way. In fact, I think they still have the largest market capitalization at least in the United States. Let's just quickly grab that number real fast, just so we can get a sense. Market capitalization refers to the dollar value of their outstanding shares of stock. The last time I looked, it was over $3 trillion. Let's see where we're looking. Here it is. It's just 2.99 trillion. Okay. There's a reason for that. But even they have to borrow money. They issue bonds to the public. And the purpose of those bonds is to raise money to invest in their own products. So they're constantly developing newer versions of their own products because they know that that's the only way to be successful. With a high-tech company like that, you got to have the newest of everything. Otherwise, people go somewhere else. And there's lots of competition waiting, behind the scenes for them. So this is they have to do it. Governments, as we mentioned earlier, they borrow money to cover their deficits. They're not doing this for profit. There's no profit motive, let's say. And then you also get in the United States, a lot of foreign companies borrow money here. In a lot of cases, it's because they're actually producing some of their products in the United States. So, for example, Toyota. We sell a lot of cars in the United States, but the ones that I see driving around out here were probably built in the United States. They wouldn't build them in Tokyo and then ship them across the ocean. They're usually built right here. Okay, it's cheaper, it's closer, makes the US government happy. You know what I mean? It's like it avoids the need for higher tariffs, let's say. So, but because they're doing their business in the United States, they need dollars. Okay, so in principle, they could borrow dollars in Japan, but it's probably easier to just borrow them right here. So a lot of foreign companies who are doing business in the United States will borrow funds in the United States in dollars. Okay. Now, foreign governments sometimes come into the US to borrow money here too. And part of the reason for that is because interest rates may be lower here than in their own domestic markets. So like Brazil, for example, borrows enormous quantities of money every year because they always have huge deficits. And there may not be enough money in Brazil to borrow. I mean, these are large amounts of money, so they may issue bonds in the United States because the capital markets are so much larger here. So these are all potential borrowers of funds in the United States. They are the ones who provide the demand for funds. Now, of course, households can borrow money for many different reasons, but you can see, a lot of this is to do with what are called durable goods, very expensive long-term goods that are meant to last for a long time, like a house or a car or appliances or whatever the case may be. It's not that you can't borrow money for other reasons, but a lot of a lot of these types of products are financed with loans. Okay. You could go to a dealer and buy a car with cash, but nobody does that. Why would you? And of course, college. Oh my God. Yes, that's one of the big sources of borrowing too. Um, so, but this is all for consumption. Now, this one you can't really, when your children are the right age, you have to send them to college. But these, though, the demand for these funds will depend directly on the level of interest rates in the economy. So, um, in other words, if rates start creeping down again, you can expect to see more people buying new houses, more people buying new cars, et cetera, because it just lowers the cost of borrowing. It's just that simple. So when the economy starts to struggle, the Federal Reserve System, as we'll see later on, will lower interest rates to help keep the economy as strong as possible. Eventually, that gets reversed when they start becoming concerned about inflation, because one of the unfortunate side effects of prosperity is that the economy is growing and booming, prices do tend to go up. So at some point, rates will start creeping up again. But when the economy is sluggish, the Fed will lower rates to help encourage people to continue spending. Right? We don't want the economy to fall into recession. We don't want a depression. And so the Fed is there waiting to help stimulate the economy by keeping rates at a level that's consistent with the level of economic activity. Now, here's our first curve. Well, the first for the book. This is what the demand curve will look like for what's called loanable funds. You notice the notation they're using, D with a little h subscript, means the demand just from households. Okay, so now the interest rate, if you notice, we're talking about before. Here I've got a P for the price. This is a dollar price. But if you can think of an interest rate as the price of borrowing money, then that certainly you can make the case that this belongs to the vertical axis. And here is the quantity of available funds. So from the household perspective, just like with pizza, when the rates are high, we don't borrow as much. Okay, when the rates are high, you keep living in an apartment a little longer, or you keep your old car longer. You do not often, unless there's some reason why you have to. You're going to try to cut back on spending on expensive, durable goods when rates are very high. Okay, so the demand for loanable funds from the household sector is certainly going to be downward sloping. just like the traditional demand curve for any other product in the market. Okay. Now, who else borrows money? Businesses, yes, like I was saying, um, you know perfectly well that businesses need to borrow constantly. They can issue stocks, and this is we'll have this discussion later on, but for the most part, businesses raise funds, long-term funds, I mean, from stocks or and bonds. Okay, now this is a very deep area of study. The decision by a corporation whether to raise funds from stocks or bonds. There's a lot of trade-offs. Um, there's a lot of advantages to issuing stocks versus bonds. But most corporations raise a fairly significant amount of their capital from bonds. Um, a lot of corporations, believe it or not, they issue stock once when they first have their first IPO, and then they never issue any new shares of stock after that. They just raise all the money from bonds. Um, the reason for that is because when you issue more shares of stock, you're diluting the ownership among with the new investors who are coming into your corporation. And some companies don't like that. They rather just borrow money from investors and just pay it back, because with stocks, there's an ownership involved. When you buy a share of stock, you actually own a piece of that company, and you're entitled to share in the profits. So if you sell more shares of stock, you're sharing your profits with more investors. On the other hand, with bonds, you've got to pay the interest rates, and if you run out of money, you're going to be finding yourself in bankruptcy court. So, bonds are riskier than stocks, but it also does not imply any new ownership. So, and by the way, corporations do borrow from banks, but usually for very short-term purposes, like if you need to meet your payroll or something happens, you need to fix something in your building or buy new equipment. But for long-term investments, they normally just issue either stocks or bonds. So now there do exist some corporations who have very, very, very little debt. Typically, high-tech companies tend to have very low levels of debt. Manufacturing companies tend to have a lot more debt because they have to finance a lot of heavy equipment. Like US Steel, for example, you can imagine it must cost a fortune to build a steel mill. Whereas, like with a software company, where all they do is write software, all they need is computers and people. They don't need a lot of equipment, so they tend to have less debt. Um, Apple, in particular, has a very, very low level of debt. They always have. Microsoft is another one. They tend to raise more of their funds from stocks than from bonds. But that's a decision that depends on the individual corporation. There's all these different factors that have to be taken into account, including tax considerations. But most corporations have some debt and some equity. Stocks are called equity, bonds are called debt. But here we're looking at basically the issuance of bonds, which means we're paying an interest rate to the investors. And so there's a lot of motivations for doing this. We may want to expand the business, might want to open an overseas branch, develop new products. In fact, if you've ever seen that show Shark Tank, um, those people haven't quite reached this level yet. These are people with a new company who have a great idea, and they just are reaching the point where they need a lot of capital to expand and take advantage of whatever they're doing. But they're not yet big enough where they are in a position to issue stocks or bonds. So they need to lean on the sharks and other venture capitalists to raise enough money to continue growing without yet having reached the point where they need to either issue stocks or bonds, because there's a lot of restrictions on issuing stocks and bonds. It's a very expensive process, and it basically has to wait until a company reaches a certain size. In the short run, the very short run, like Jeff Bezos, apparently took $10,000 out of the bank to start up Amazon. He was selling books out of his garage, literally. Then at some point, he needed more money. He would have turned to his friends and relatives, venture capitalists, and eventually he became, like one of the richest people in the world. But even he had to start out small. So here, these are corporations who are now large enough that they can issue stocks and bonds, and they often need enormous amounts of money that would be impossible to raise by simple bank loans. or even from venture capitalists. Venture capitalists don't tend to lend out enormous amounts of money. Like they might be willing to put up a few $100,000 out of their own pocket, but if a corporation needs $100 billion in a hurry, it's going to have to come from the bond markets, probably. Like I said, with Apple, I mean, God only knows how much that costs to develop those new iPhones, but it must be considerable. They may want to enter new markets, update their capital equipment, buy supplies, all these different expenses they may run into. But some of these expenses can be put off if interest rates are very high. So the demand for loanable funds, even from businesses, the demand curve is going to be downward sloping because higher interest rates is going to cut into our profits. So this one is labeled BB, B for business. And again, it is also downward sloping. Okay. The business is not going to be able to survive if they spend a fortune on their debt. Now the federal government is completely different. They have to cover their debts. If they don't, now, by the way, you probably are aware of this, but the federal government has the best credit worthiness, let's say, in the economy. Like, the idea that they would ever allow their debt not to be paid off is beyond ridiculous. They borrow a lot of money, but they have the ability to raise taxes and or sell off assets. So unlike a private corporation who could run out of money, the government can't really run out of money. So they're going to make damn sure that they cover all their debts because this is what makes it possible to borrow money at such ridiculously low rates of interest. Okay. I mean, you can see how even now, 4.5%, a corporation for the same money might have to pay 6, 7, 8, 9% interest. So they're saving a lot of money by having the best possible credit rating. So, but they have to borrow the money because they must pay their bills. They must pay their bills to avoid ruining their credit rating. So that means they're not really overly concerned about the rate of interest. Whatever it is, that's what they pay. So you can see all of a sudden the demand curve for government is vertical. Now, when you see a vertical demand curve like that, it means that it is independent of whatever's on the vertical axis. So in other words, DG1 is let's say last year's deficit was this number. This year it went up a little bit to GG2. So as the deficit grows, the curve shifts to the right, but it's not downward sloping because they must borrow enough money to cover that debt. So no matter what the rate of interest is, they have to have that money. So that's the end of it. So this is the only one that's vertical. Now, municipal governments are a little bit different. These are city, state, and local governments. Now, you're probably aware of it, but like, for example, the state of New York issues its own bonds. A large city like Yonkers or White Plains would have its own bonds. Westchester County probably has its own bonds. This is usually meant for local projects, like that new Tappan Zee Bridge in Tarrytown, which I don't remember when they finished it, but I seem to remember reading somewhere that it cost like $3. Um, oh, 4 billion. Oh, well, this is still before they finished. Um, 4 billion. Okay. Now, $4 billion is a lot of money. Where did they get it from? They issued bonds. They issued a special type of bond, which is called municipal bonds. Now, these are very attractive to people in very high tax brackets because what typically happens is they pay a relatively low rate of interest, but they also typically provide extremely generous tax benefits, meaning that there's very little or no tax at all. So these are mostly bought by wealthy individuals because it wouldn't make any sense for anyone else. So, like Donald Trump might own a bunch of these municipal bonds because it makes sense for him, but you and I could do better just by going into the treasury market. But they, again, they have to cover, they have to pay for the bridge. They can't just say, well, let's build a bridge and worry about the money later. So they issue these bonds, and but they're normally meant for some specific purpose. Like, you can say these bonds are meant for the Tappan Zee Bridge, or these bonds are meant for fixing 287, let's say. Um, and so municipal governments normally pay all their bills. But unlike the federal government, it's not absolutely guaranteed. It's the city of New York actually defaulted on their bonds in 1976. And I mean, I guess nobody remembers that now, but it does happen. In fact, a few years ago, the city of Detroit ran out of money and they couldn't pay their bills either. So these bonds are not as safe as treasury bills, treasury bonds, but they're close. Okay. It depends on what government it happens to be, but so these are meant for specific purposes. And in fact, private schools like Manhattanville, if they suddenly realize they need a bunch of money to fix the dorms or something, there's actually a government agency. It's called the New York State Dormitory Authority, and they can say, well, listen, New York State, we need $10 million in a hurry. They can actually borrow it from the Dormitory Authority, and then the state of New York issues bonds to investors to pay for it. And then they pay it back over time. So it's like private schools can turn to this government agency if they need a bunch of money in a hurry. So it does happen. Like they need a new dorm or they need a new library or something. Um, they don't have that kind of money laying around. So this is one way they can raise that money. So this one, these governments can postpone projects if the interest rates are very high. Like it depends on what the project is. Like the Tappan Zee Bridge apparently was ready to fall apart, so they had to get that done in a hurry. But there's a lot of projects that can be postponed if interest rates are very high. So because of that, the demand for municipal governments is also downward sloping, meaning it is somewhat sensitive to interest rates. Although there's a limit to how far they can push that. You know how it is. And then the foreigners, like again, if they're doing business over here or foreign governments, they're going to be very sensitive to interest rates in the United States because otherwise they could just borrow at home. So their demand curve is also downward sloping. So the overall total demand, which we in economics we often use the word aggregate to refer to the total supply and demand for something. If you put them all together, you're going to get this one big demand curve, DA for aggregate, and you can see it is also downward sloping. And so that is the aggregate or total demand for loanable funds in the US economy. And again, you can see it is directly related to the level of interest rates. If any of these components increases, the entire curve will shift to the right. Okay, let's say, for example, the government suddenly has bigger deficits than usual, and they have to, borrow more money. I'll call this DA1 and DA2. This means an increase in the total demand. Loanable funds. And it could come from any of those sources. Normally it shifts to the right. It could go to the left too. Like during a recession, businesses might cut and households will probably cut back on their borrowing, and you could actually see it shift to the left. It's not impossible, although over time it tends to grow, but it could go either way. So you can call that, let's say, D3. And you'll see later on that that will influence the interest rate itself. Okay. So yes, and this is the house behind. I mean, if we had the actual numbers, we could put them all together and come up with the numbers. We don't actually have that information right here, of course, but economists work on this stuff all the time. They could probably come up with reasonably good estimates for how much demand there is out there for these different sources. And then we have the supply. Now that's coming from savers. Ultimately, it's coming from households. Um, Households save, although not much in the United States, as you probably know. The savings rate in the US is quite small, 2 to 4%, something like that. Businesses can save if they have, well, if they have profits that they're not distributing to the stockholders, they can actually increase the availability of loanable funds. Governments, governments would need to have surpluses to do that. And it's not likely to happen. I mean, the thing is, all of these and by the way, the Fed can jump in and add loanable funds to the system anytime they need to. But for the most part, most of the supply is coming right here from households. These guys tend to have, tend to have on average borrow more than they save. Okay, where it's households are really most of the supply is coming from. Um, Although you can, in this case, you can get funds from abroad. For example, uh, the Chinese central bank and the Japanese central bank both hold huge portfolios of treasury securities, which means that they're basically lending us money. And that helps keep our interest rates lower than they otherwise would be. But now the Federal Reserve System, we're going to spend more time on that later on, but the Federal Reserve System is actually what we call the central bank of the United States. It has a very, very interesting history, which we'll discuss at some point, but it's a little different than other countries' central banks. For one thing, it's relatively new. You might think it's been around for hundreds of, well, US is coming up in its 250th birthday. The Federal Reserve System was only created in 1913. You figure, wait a minute, how is that possible? What happened before that? Well, we actually had a couple of central banks earlier there was one in the when Alexander Hamilton was still alive. It was called the First Bank of the United States. It was his idea. He really was a very forward-looking individual when it came to finance. He really was quite a visionary, as a matter of fact. He felt like, here we are with the United States, with this newly independent country. We're mostly farmers, right? But we want to be a rich, powerful country one day. We're going to need some kind of modern banking system like the British have. So he convinced George Washington that, in Congress, that we should have a central bank. Now, the central bank that he created and was established in 1791, the first bank in the United States, it was nowhere near as sophisticated as the Fed. It was basically set up to, do business with the government. It accepted loans, accepted tax payments. It did some things that a central bank does, but not nearly what we have today. It was only given a 20-year charter by Congress, which expired in 1811. Now, that time ended, Hamilton had already died, and he was its main advocate. So the charter was allowed to expire. So in 1816, the Congress said, let's try this again. And they created the Second Bank of the United States, which also was given a 20-year charter. And the problem was that when it came time to think about renewing the charter, the one person who really did not want it to survive was President Andrew Jackson. He made sure that it was not rechartered. And that was it. That was the end of central banking in the United States until 1913, when it became clear that we really do need to have a central bank again as a result of something called the Panic of 1907. And where J.P. Morgan had to literally bail out the city of New York with his own money. And so in 1913, Congress said, yeah, let's do this. Let's have a central bank. We need one. Let's do this. And so the Fed was created. And now it was originally meant to be not a single central bank, but a system of central banks. So in other words, you may have noticed there are actually 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. One of the most important one, of course, is in New York City. If you look at dollar bills, in this day and age, who even uses dollar bills anymore? But if you look at your dollar bills, you'll see that each one tells you which of the 12 central Federal Reserve banks issued it. It says right on there somewhere, there's a seal with a big letter there, and it tells you where it came from. And so there's 12 of them. And so what they do is, among many other things, is they issue currency in their own districts. And so like, you don't maybe not realizing it, paper money wears out pretty quickly. It has to be replaced fairly regularly, every few years for dollar bills. And so what happens is when people bring worn out dollar bills to banks, the banks put them aside, they give the customers new dollar bills, they send the old ones to the Fed has them shredded up, and then they issue new ones, and then those are then issued back into the banking system. The currency is actually printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington. And you can actually visit that. It is actually open to the public. You can go in there and watch them printing paper money if you're interested. Um, and the coins, on the other hand, are issued by the US Mint. Okay. There's one located in Philadelphia, there's one of them in Denver. And again, they're open to the public. You can walk in the door and get online, and you can see the coins being made if you feel so inclined. And so those are issued through the Treasury Department into the banking system. And but the Fed actually ultimately issues paper money into its banks, its own local banks. And so you can see right in the dollar bill, it identifies which Federal Reserve Bank issued that particular dollar bill. So the next time you take a dollar bill out of your pocket, if it ever happens again, just take a look at it and you'll see. In fact, let's take a quick look. I'd hold one up to the camera, but it'll be backwards. I don't want that. See that little C there? That tells us that this was issued by the Philadelphia Fed. Okay. How do you like that? And they all have one of those 12 right there. Okay. Not the higher bills. I don't know why. It's just the ones. Yeah, and our paper money, there's actually three Federal Reserve banks that have a museum of American money. If you are ever in San Francisco, Chicago, or Philadelphia, the Federal Reserve banks in those cities have a museum of American money that you can go look at. And I've been to the one in Philadelphia. It is really interesting. Really interesting. One day, maybe we'll just go over some of these interesting historical notes and coins, but it's quite an interesting story. Okay, yeah. All right, but anyway, so the Fed is the central bank of the United States. Now, the most important thing they do is they conduct what's called monetary policy. In other words, they're the ones who ultimately decide what the level of interest rates should be in the economy. And so, when things are going badly in the economy, they tend to lower rates to help stimulate the economy. When things are going well and they're worried about inflation, they tend to raise rates to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of hand. So now later on, we'll have an entire chapter dedicated to the Fed, but for now, it's enough to know that there's two basic types of monetary policy. When the economy is doing poorly, the Fed lowers rates by expanding the money supply. We call that expansionary monetary policy. They're making it easier for the banks to lend out money. That's the purpose of this. When they're worried about inflation, on the other hand, you shrink up the amount of money that's available in the economy, and that has the effect of raising interest rates. And so right about now, the Fed is kind of in a neutral holding pattern. I think they want to lower rates, and inflation is quite low again, but I think they're waiting. They're biding their time a little bit. They'll probably cut rates sometime later this year. But who knows? You never know what they're thinking over there. they tend to be very mysterious about what they're thinking. And we'll see how it goes. Um, so anyway, so the supply of loanable funds. Now, again, the Fed can jump in if they feel the need and they can increase loanable funds in the economy. But mostly the supply is coming from these sources. Households, businesses, the federal government, if they have a surplus, municipal governments, same thing, and foreigners. So the logic is exactly the same, except the supply curve is upward sloping. So we're going to look at these one at a time. So here comes the total. Well, actually, okay, so we only have the one graph here. The total looks like this. It's upward sloping because obviously when rates go up, people are going to be willing to save and invest more to earn a higher rate of interest. Okay. Um, like, if imagine like right now, even with rates falling, reaching more normal levels, you're not really getting a whole lot of interest in the savings account, for example. But if one day all of a sudden the banks announce that they'll give you 10% on your savings accounts, people are going to scrape together every nickel they have and put it in the bank to save because they want to take advantage of higher rates of interest. So as interest rates go up, the amount of money that people are willing to invest and save is also going to go up as well. So the supply curve is going to be upward sloping for loanable funds. Okay, so you can bring them all together like we did with demand, and you can see this brings us to the aggregate supply or total supply of loanable funds. Now, what's going to happen then? By the way, they make an interesting point here. If you look at, well, the way they drew these, move back to this document for a second. The demand curve for loanable funds is kind of flat. It's downward sloping, but it's kind of flat. The supply curve is pretty steep. The A means aggregate. And so they're going to explain that in a second, but this would determine the equilibrium level of interest rates in the economy. Um, and so if rates are above that, of course, here there would be a surplus, which means the rates would drop. If they're too low, there'll be a shortage. And then rates would tend to rise. So what they're going to discuss here in a second is this concept of elasticity. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. The supply curve for loanable funds is steeper than the demand curve. This indicates that the supply of loanable funds is more sensitive to interest rates than the demand. Now, you can see why, though, because a lot of that borrowing is coming from organizations that really don't have a whole lot of choice. Like the government has to cover their deficit, businesses have a lot of expenses they have to cover, households have some flexibility. They can decide not to buy a new house if rates are too high, for example. But overall, the amount of borrowing is kind of locked in for a lot of these organizations. So the sensitivity to interest rates will be not as great as it would be for the supply, where the supply loanable funds, people have a lot of other options for investing their money. Like if they don't put their money in the bank, for example, they could just buy stocks and that type of thing. So that means investors require a very high interest rate to save more money. And so that the this builds us up to this concept of elasticity, where elasticity refers to the sensitivity of the supply demand for both funds. Those think of elasticity as another word for sensitivity. I'm going to discuss that in the slides in a second. So in other words, we can say that the supply of local funds is more elastic than the demand. So the Fed changes the rate of interest, it's going to have a bigger impact on the supply than the demand. That's what they're saying here. So the word elasticity is used a lot in economics to indicate the sensitivity of one variable with respect to another one. Okay, how much does one affect the other? Whoops. Stay there. All right, so let's see what this is all about. So, yeah, this is not a very deep discussion about elasticity. I just wanted to mention that terminology, but it really is nothing but sensitivity. How much does your demand for loanable funds change when rates go up or down? And how much does the supply change? Um, in a microeconomics class, you'd spend like a couple of weeks studying elasticities. But all we need to know here is that it refers to how much sensitive or how much does the market react to changes in interest rates. Now, we're going to bring together, here we go. This is what we've been building up to. This is the equilibrium level of interest rates. You can see it comes at the intersection of the supply and demand curves. And anywhere else will not be in equilibrium. There'll be an automatic adjustment back towards this equilibrium level of interest. Okay, so they're using the letter I here to indicate the interest rate. Here you can use the Q. And so for any other interest rate, there's going to be an adjustment until we reach back to this equilibrium level. If rates are too high, we can draw that even on this graph right here. It's a surplus because people want to lend a lot of money, but nobody wants to borrow it. Okay. Or not enough people want to borrow it. So in other words, rates are at very high levels. So businesses are borrowing less, households are borrowing less. So there's a surplus of loanable funds. And the reaction to that, interest rates will start to creep down until we restore the equilibrium level. But if rates are unusually low, everyone's going to want to borrow money at this rate. It's like, imagine if mortgages were available for 1%. What do you think is going to happen? Everybody on the planet is going to buy a house. So, but then all of a sudden there's not enough money to lend out to everyone. So rates will start to creep up again. And ultimately, she'll always find ourselves right about here. Depending on the market, deviations from equilibrium shouldn't last too long. In some markets, it'll be eliminated faster than others, but you don't expect it to stay off equilibrium for very long. Now, of course, if one of these curves changes, that will affect our equilibrium level. Like for example, I guess I could sneak one in right here. Uh, let's call this new one. Let's say that for some reason people start to save more. So you can see this, there's an increase in the supply of vulnerable funds. And you can see the wonderful impact to this is that interest rates drop. Now, if it's the other way around, people decide not to save so much, the curve will shift back to the left and it'll be will be up here. Actually, I might as well draw a separate diagram for that. Yeah, this is when, people decide, we don't want to save, we want to buy things. Okay. So you can see that interest rates go up. So of course interest rates will go up. What else would you expect? I mean, really. Um, Not as many people are willing to lend out money. So, in other words, people will lend you the money, but you've got to be prepared to pay a higher interest rate for it. Okay. So those are two things that can happen with the supply. The demand, same thing. The demand can shift around. It depends on, market conditions. Let's say the demand goes up, and this could be caused by a lot of things. Like businesses want to borrow more to expand their operations. In fact, this is what happens during a recovery normally. Um, the reason why rates creep up during a recovery is because, among other things, people want to buy things that they've been waiting for to. People that have been postponing the purchase of cars or houses or whatever, and now they feel like the time has come to buy those things. Or businesses think the economy is going well, I might as well expand my operations. So the demand for funds will go up, and of course, interest rates will start to creep up too. This is how it always during the business cycle, on an upswing when the economy is booming, interest rates always go up. And this is the main reason for it because there's an increase in the demand for these loanable funds. Okay, so this is an increase. And then here interest rates rise, of course. So it might not sound like such a good thing, but it usually indicates a healthy economy. Now, of course, it's also possible that this is caused by higher inflation, which is not a good thing. But we don't know what's causing this. But as long as the demand is going up, um, we know that interest rates have to rise as well because the supply doesn't really change that quickly. And then, of course, we can have the opposite recession. People are cutting back on everything. So, of course, the net effect is lower interest rates. So those are the four possibilities. Now, of course, it's also possible for both curves to shift around, but then it gets very complicated, and the impact depends on which one moves more than the other. But for these four simple cases, we have an increase in supply or demand, or decrease or increase in supply, demand rather. And so those are the way that they affect interest rates. Now, what can cause changes in these curves? Well, let's see. We have potentially economic growth, inflation, monetary policy, government deficits, and the foreign flows of funds. In other words, investors borrowing money in the United States, investors lending money in the United States, opening their businesses, et cetera, et cetera. How do they affect interest rates? Well, as we were discussing just now, the economy grows, consumers will have more money to borrow or want to borrow more. Like, when do you buy something expensive, like a new car or a new house? When things are going well, the economy is booming, your income is growing. So now is the time to jump into the housing market, let's say, and buy a new house or buy a new car or whatever. So when growth accelerates in the economy, and the same thing from businesses' perspective, the more profitable they are, the more likely they are to want to expand what they're doing. And so in both cases, the demand for loanable funds will go up and interest rates will go up as well. As we saw, that means the curve is shifting to the right. And the result, of course, is higher interest rates. And that's always the way it works in a business cycle. When the economy is doing well, rates go up. When it's doing poorly, rates go down. But if people start to become nervous about the future, the last thing, if you're worried about your job, for example, that's not the time to be buying a house or a new car. So, or businesses, they don't want to expand if they're not confident that people will buy their products. So when the economy is struggling, then people will borrow less. Businesses will borrow less. The demand curve shifts to the left and rates will start dropping down. Okay. So, and there could be other reasons too. Like governments could stop borrowing so much money, but that doesn't happen very often. Inflation. Now, of course, we know what inflation is. The cost of living goes up. And so you may need to borrow more money just to maintain your standards of living. Businesses may have to borrow more money to pay for the same quantity of supplies and that type of thing. So and by the way, we're going to introduce now a very famous result in economics called the Fisher effect. So Irving Fisher is actually a very important figure in economic history. He wrote this very famous book in the 1930s about interest rates. He was a very interesting person. He was the first person to get a PhD in economics from Yale. He was an academic, but he also invented something that you may have heard about at some point in your life. I'm going to show you a picture of this device that Irving Fisher invented, and either you're going to say, "What is that thing?" or you're going to say, "Wow, I haven't seen one of these in ages." Now, this is ancient technology, by the way. What is this thing? What is it doing there? Well, this is how you keep track of business cards or recipes or whatever the case may be. You spin the cards until you find the right one. You see how that works? This is Fisher's idea. He made a lot of money from this thing. And so he was able to afford to have a very nice lifestyle, even though he was an academic and he had the time to write his books. So I guess you can still buy one of these if you really feel so inclined. You might say, "Wow, I don't trust technology. Maybe I'll just, have myself a Rolodex." But the most of the time I've seen these being used for recipes. That's when it really comes in handy. But there's like contacts. Like if this was like 50 years ago, everyone would have one of these on their desk. And so if you wanted to look up, oh, got it, my client's name is John Smith. Oh, here's his information right here in front of me. And that's how it was done. Wow. I'm sure they still have them if somebody wants one. So that was his, yes, Irving Fisher invented that. And so he wrote his book. And what he's essentially trying to do here is explain the relationship between what are called real interest rates, which means they've been adjusted for inflation, and nominal interest rates, which are the ones that we observe in the marketplace. So it's a very simple idea. Let me just write this down somewhere. A nominal rate of interest, and this is true for all variables, by the way, a nominal rate is one that is not adjusted for inflation. This is the actual rate in the marketplace. So let's say, for example, if you go to the bank and they tell you that we offer 6% mortgage rates, that's a nominal rate. Okay. A real rate of interest is one that is adjusted for inflation. Okay. So in other words, they've stripped out the rate of inflation. So what's left over is the actual cost of borrowing money or the actual rate of return. And so it's a much more meaningful value because nominal rate of interest tells an investor how many dollars will earn on an investment, which is fine, but a real rate of interest tells an investor how much his purchasing power will increase as a result of an investment. So just as a quick example, I mean, if let's say a bank pays 5% and the inflation rate is 2%, at the end of 1 year, an investor will have 5% more dollars, will have 3% more purchasing power because 2% of it was lost to the higher rate of inflation. Okay. So that last number, this is the real. Think of this as the nominal rate of return. And this is the real rate of return. It's the one that really matters. Okay. So like, yeah, if you're planning for your retirement, for example, that's the number that matters, not the nominal. Who cares? The nominal is nothing. It's the real that tells you if you're getting ahead. So this is what the Fisher effect is all about. He's basically saying that the nominal rate, that I is nominal, this is real. This is actually written this way to show that this is actually the expected inflation rate. Because banks make decisions about how much interest to charge customers. They don't know what the rate of inflation will be over the next year or 5 years or whatever. They're basing that on their expectations. So this is how the rate would be determined. How much real returns you want to get, or how much do you need to compensate you for your risk, and then how much inflation will reduce your purchasing power, and that gives us the nominal rate of interest. Okay. So financial planners, and I know somebody who is a professional financial planner, would recommend you try not to overdo it with the money in your savings account because usually you're going to end up with a negative rate of return in real terms if you keep your money in the savings account. Not always, but yeah. Now, if inflationary expectations rise, let's say for some reason we become convinced that rate inflation is heading up. We hear in the news all this negative information. Um, by the way, there's a lot of indicators you can follow in the marketplace that helps you decide. Like um, in this particular case, let me just briefly mention that I'll just toss a little bit of that into here. Um, and we'll discuss this again, I think, later in the course, but the CPI, Consumer Price Index, is a measure of cost of living for consumers, as you can probably imagine. You probably heard at least tossed about in the news. Um, the inflation rate, um, mostly mentioned in the media, refers to the percentage change. Unless they tell you otherwise, this is what they're talking about, the percentage change in the CPI from one year to the next. This is what they mean by the inflation rate. Because it affects, this tells me how much it costs for me as an individual to buy the things that I normally buy during a given year. So you can observe this. You could read this in the Wall Street Journal. The CPI went up 3% this month compared to last year. Okay, fine. My cost of living went up 3% this year. But there's also something called the PPI, Producer Price Index, is a measure of the cost of producing goods and services, businesses. So the reason why this is important is because if this number goes up, it often translates into higher inflation down the road. So economists follow this number very closely. Traders on Wall Street follow this number very closely. So if the PPI suddenly spikes up, that makes the markets nervous because it means that maybe inflation is coming back or going up again. So you can think of it as almost a forecast of the future value of CPI. Now, it doesn't always work out. I mean, it can go up and down for a lot of reasons. Sometimes there's temporary supply disruptions, things like that. But if there's a persistent trend upward, the PPI, that usually means that inflation is heading up. So investors will see this and they'll adjust their inflationary expectations. And then all of a sudden, they begin to realize, you know what, maybe I'm going to get a lower real return than I thought for my savings. So that means they're going to hold out for a higher rate of interest when they decide to lend their money out. Because, they realize that inflation might reduce more of their purchasing power. So if somebody sees the PPI rising, if the people in general see it rising, they may say, well, we expect rate inflation to go up, which means that we're going to require higher returns to invest our money. So if these inflationary expectations rise, we're going to need to borrow more to maintain the real value of our borrowing, our standards of living. But then at the same time, the households will save less because it's less advantageous to save when inflation is going up. So the net effect of this would be interest rates will go up in the economy because we got two negative effects happening here. The supply is going to the left. Less supply, more demand. The only thing that can happen is the price goes up. Even though this is still expectations, these expectations may never materialize. We may be wrong. But as long as people believe that rates are heading up, they'll start to rise today. Okay. Now people realize, wait a minute, what's going on here? Inflation is not rising, well, then the rates would tend to drop back down again. But right now, people are concerned, and then so rates start to creep up. Or if we keep seeing a lower PPI, Well, then it's the other way around. People will accept a lower real rate of return on their investments. And so, um, yeah, the purpose of mentioning this, so if the P, let me add this in here because it's incomplete right now. Um, if PPI persistently rises persistently, this will increase inflationary expectations and vice versa. So it's one sign. There's many. There's so many other measures out there, but that's one that people are paying very close attention to. So if you ever notice, like when you're watching the stock market, you can actually go to the Fed. They have a calendar in here somewhere of I think the Fed is the one. Yeah, here it is. So you're saying, well, maybe I better find out when the next PPI number is going to come out. Now, some of these are more important than others. Their CPI is coming out on the 13th of May. Oh, it's already coming out. Okay. Um, Where's PPI? There's all kinds of indicators. Oh, no, that's personal consumption. Um, Interesting. Where did it go? New house. Oh, this is a big one. New housing. Oh my God. Um, that everyone pays close attention to that one. Let me tell you. If that one is slumping, everyone's going to panic, and you can be sure the markets will go down. I don't know. I don't see it. But GDP, oh my God, that one couldn't be any more important. That's GDP is the entire economy. So if GDP is going up, that's strong. That's good for the economy. It's going down, then that's as bad as it gets. Um, that's interesting. I don't see PPI listed, but anyway, so all these indicators are coming out. By the way, if you just want a quick look at the markets, there's one really nice website you can look at here. I do this all the time. CNBC.com. Um, Now, now, by the way, the markets are closed. These numbers are, these are actually futures contracts, which we'll discuss later in the course. These futures contracts are trading in overseas markets. And when these are going up, it means people in Asia probably by now are expressing their opinion that the Dow will go up tomorrow. They're looking at the earnings, um, indicators that are coming out, and they're saying it looks promising. So this is sort of a forecast of where the markets are headed tomorrow. Um, they often mention this is the 10-year Treasury security, 10-year Treasury yield. Oil prices, of course, all kinds of stuff here. But yeah, we like to see a lot of green on the stage. Okay, well, anyway. Also, if you really and truly want to look up some of this information, among all the different feds, the one at St. Louis has this economic database. It's called FRED, which stands for the Federal Reserve Economic Database. It's run by the St. Louis Fed. And let's say you do want to know GPI. Where's it going? Where's it been? Well, I'm here to Fred. And well, Fred's going to tell you everything you want to know about PPI. You can either have a nice little graph, you can download the data into an Excel spreadsheet, and it gives you a sense of where prices are heading. Okay, so Fed has a lot of this stuff. It's all free because the Fed, the Fed is actually a very interesting organization. It is technically It's privately held. Officially, it's privately held. It is not a profit-making institution, but it makes a lot of profits because of its daily activities. It has tons of money. It has money coming in all over the place. They can afford to give this to us for free. They're not there to make money, let's say, but they are making money. So what they do is they use it to help reduce the US deficit. But the beauty of that is they don't need a budget from Congress, which means Congress can't tell them what to do. They're completely independent. They do what they have to do. Right. Anyway, so higher inflationary expectations, more borrowing, less savings, which means higher interest rates. So this happens a lot in economics. You see that a lot of variables are sort of, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do we expect higher inflation? Everything goes up. Okay. Um, Now, of course, if we are more optimistic, then the opposite would happen. Now, monetary policy, which we'll again have a deeper discussion about this in a later chapter, the Federal Reserve System has the ability to increase or decrease the money supply in the economy. They do that through the banking system. They can increase the amount of reserves, as they're called, that the banks can lend out to customers, or they can reduce them in order to regulate the level of lending in the economy. So what they're trying to do is keep the economy as stable as possible. They want to keep inflation low. They want to keep unemployment low. They want to keep the dollar relatively strong. Um, they want, the markets to be stable. So they keep tinkering with the money supply to keep interest rates at the levels that they think are consistent with where the economy is right now. And it's a fairly complicated process. The rate of interest that you hear it talked about in the press all the time is the federal funds rate. Okay, that is their primary instrument of monetary policy. They don't directly control the federal funds rate, but they influence it. In fact, you can look it up. It changes fairly regularly. Probably a chart. No, it's in the four region right now. You can see during the COVID, it was essentially zero. I mean, it goes up, it goes down. These gray lines represent recessions typically. So you can see what happens is it starts to drop. The economy is slowing down, they start to lower it. And then as the economy wakes up again, they start to raise it. And so the federal funds rate is intended to be what's called countercyclical, meaning that when the economy is slow, they lower rates. When the economy is strong, they raise rates. They act as a counterbalance to keep either unemployment from rising too much or inflation. Right around here, inflation was at preposterously high levels in the late 70s, early 80s. That's why the rates are so high here. Like it got to the point where mortgages were like 16%. Um, so yeah, we haven't seen that kind of inflation since then, thank God. But yeah, it has happened here. So this is the federal funds rate. This is the one that the Fed has indirect control over. And so again, the economy is sluggish, they kind of push it down. Part of that is, and then when the economy is strong, they raise it back up again. Because ultimately, it may not seem like it, but ultimately their number one priority is to keep inflation under control. Um, they try their best to keep it from going above 2% whenever possible. So this is what they're aiming for. So what that means is they can step in now if they feel like the economy is too sluggish, they can increase to their own activities the supply of loanable funds in the economy. And that will, of course, lower interest rates. Okay, in other words, they introduce funds into the banking system. which makes the banks able to lend out more money to the customers and then forces interest rates to drop. Okay. And that's called expansionary monetary policy, by the way, because the goal is to expand the money supply, which in turn expands the size of the economy. If they're worried about inflation, they reduce the amount of funds that are available. That reduces the supply curve. The supply curve shifts to the left, and suddenly rates start to go up. Okay. Now that happened, as you can see from this chart. Let's say the COVID was more over. They really pushed it up to much more normal levels. Okay, they were really worried about inflation. Okay, all right. Deficits, like I said, more deficits means more demand for funds, higher interest rates. It's as simple as that. Okay. Um, now foreigners do supply a lot of funds to the United States. Um, so the book has this example about the US dollar and the Brazilian real. The real is another currency. It has a very interesting history of its own. There was a time when Brazil's inflation rate in the 90s was over, it was 2,000% a year. It was something really ridiculous. So they decided, out of sheer desperation, they retired their old currency, the Cruzeiro, and replaced it with this new one called the Real. But they also backed it up with a firm commitment to keep the money supply from growing like crazy. Um, and they've been pretty successful so far. The real has been very strong most of this time. Their inflation rate is much, much lower than it used to be. But they still have much higher interest rates than you would get in the United States because they tend to have a lot more inflation. Even then, they still have more inflation. Um, but what they're trying to show you here is that interest rates are higher in Brazil than in the United States, even if they have the same inflation rate, for a few reasons. For one thing, the government has the deficits are just beyond belief enormous. So the supply of loanable funds in Brazil is artificially reduced by that. The demand is artificially increased. And so in relative terms, Brazil's interest rates are quite a bit higher than the US, even when they have similar inflation rates. It has a lot to do with the just enormous, unbelievable deficits that they have. Now, I actually have met people from Brazil, and apparently in Brazil they have enormous tariffs on foreign goods because they want to protect their own markets, but the cost of living is quite a bit higher in Brazil than in the United States. And so when they come to the US, they buy everything in sight and bring it back home with them because they know that it's going to be more expensive at home. And it's not just Brazil. I know somebody whose sister lives in Italy, and whenever she comes to visit New York City in the Christmas time, she goes nuts and buys everything she can find in the stores in the US because it's that much cheaper. And in fact, every year around Christmas time, you get a lot of foreigners shopping in the United States, in New York City at least, because it's just worth their while to take a flight to the US and buy all their Christmas presents in New York because it's that much cheaper. So anyway, so this is chapter 2. Now, 3, this was the determination of interest rates. 3 is a little bit different. Now, what's interesting about 3 is that we know that at any given, in chapter 2, we're basically keeping things simple, assuming that there's a single rate of interest in the economy. But we know that that's not the case. Just looking at that chart we had for the treasuries, I may have turned it off. Hold on. These $1 bills, look at that. Look at this silver certificate. You realize that at one point in time, um, dollar bills could be traded directly for silver on demand. It says in $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand, meaning you could take it to any bank and insist on being given $1 worth of silver. Um, oh, those were the days. All right. Um, oh, yes. So, Treasury. So just a quick casual look at this. Oh, this no, no. What's that? Here. So this is just a casual look at. Let's go back to the current level. If you notice, these numbers are not the same across the board. They're not that much different. At different points in history, there would have been much larger discrepancies between, let's say, the 1 month and the 30-year rates. It used to be, let's see. Yeah, even here, they're not very, very different. Oh, okay. There's an interesting year. At the very short end of this curve, it's called the yield curve, as we'll see in a minute. Um, the rates are very low, and then they start to go up fairly quickly. And all of a sudden, in 30 years, you're looking at 298. The question is why? How come if I'm saving my money by buying a treasury security, if I buy a 1 month treasury security here, I'm only getting 0.17%. If I buy a 30-year security, I get 2.98%. Why? So that's one of the things we want to address in chapter 3. Why are there different interest rates in the economy, even with the same level of credit? In other words, all of these are considered to be free of credit risk. And yet, I mean, the only thing that separates one from another is the maturity, the length of time in which you're investing your money. So why is there such a big difference between the 30-year rate and the 1 month rate? What is going on with that? Now that's an interesting question. So at any given time, there's an array of interest rates available to investors. Now, this also, if we now compare this to, let's say, the corporate bond market, if I buy a 30-year Apple bond, I'm going to be offered a higher interest rate than I am here. And again, the question is why? So it's not just within the same type of securities. There's all kinds of different interest rates available in the economy. So what is it that separates them from each other? Well, in this chapter, we're going to claim that pretty much the differences are driven by maturity, as we just saw, risk, which mainly refers to credit risk, liquidity, and the tax treatment, if it's different from one security to another. All right, now, what I've done here, this is actually what we were just looking at. This is the term structure for the treasury market, which is often referred to as the term structure of interest rates. The word term in this case means maturity, by the way. So in other words, this is a 30-year security. Its term is 30 years. Okay. By the way, before I go any further, just to avoid confusion, I just want to mention the naming conventions in the treasury market. Bonds that have maturity of 1 month to 1 year are known as treasury bills. The ones that run from 2 years to 10 years are known as treasury notes. And then the ones that run from 20 to 30 years are known as treasury bonds. although they're all collectively known as treasury securities or just treasuries. I mean, they're all bonds when you come right down to it. I'm not quite sure how and why this came about, but a treasury bill specifically means a maturity of 1 year or less. 2 to 10 is a note, and 20 to 30 is a bond. It doesn't go past 30. Um, it just doesn't because people don't want them. That's as far as they go. In the corporate market, it's a little bit different. As a matter of fact, um, it is very, I'll just mention this here, is unusual for bonds in the United States to have maturities of more than 30 years. There's just something about that number. People aren't interested. They do exist. Some government agency bonds do have 40-year maturities, but occasionally corporations issue very long-term bonds. In the 90s, Disney issued a, believe it or not, 100-year bond known as a Cinderella. So 100 years, you have to be quite optimistic to buy a 100-year bond, don't you think? Well, luckily, no, it's not like as ridiculous as it sounds because your heirs will get the coupons after you're gone, but still 100 years. So you have to wonder what they were thinking of. But you do run into this every so often. And then during the Napoleonic Wars, if you can believe this. So in other words, they paid interest every year, but um, never repaid the original investment. In other words, with a normal bond, you're buying the bond for a fixed length of time. You get interest payments over those years, and then you get your money back at the end. They're known as either perpetuities or consols. Now, as far as I know, eventually the British government, you know what they did? They went to the market and they just bought them back from these investors. They didn't want to pay interest for the rest of eternity. So they just went into the market at some point and they just simply bought them out. Well, so there, in other words, there aren't any more of them out there. Um, but I mean, you can see why they would do this. They didn't know if they were going to win. If Napoleon won, what are they going to do? They can't pay these bonds back. So this is one way they raised money because they were really desperate. But anyway, so by the way, here's the link to that chart that I keep trying to find. And so now, what's often done in the financial markets is we take these numbers and we draw them on a special type of graph called a yield curve. So the rates that you're seeing there are referred to as yields. That has a very specific meaning, which we'll discuss when we get to the bond markets. But you can think of it as the rate of return to a bond. And these are the maturities. And at some points in time, the yield curve would look like this. This is a fairly common result throughout US history. It goes up for a while and then it flattens out, but it can have any shape. In principle, it can have any shape, but usually it rises and then it starts to flatten out so that the long-term bonds have higher yields than the short-term bonds. This is normal. Usually, if it doesn't look like this, often it's because the economy is in rough shape, or there's a lot of inflation, or everyone is expecting a recession. This is normal. Now we have curves that are kind of flat looking and all these other bizarre shapes, but this is what's been normal throughout US history. Okay. So anyway, I'm looking at the clock now. I just suddenly realized we've been going on for like 2 hours here. I know this is a marathon class. We can't go 3.5 hours without a break. So we'll knock it off here for a bit. Now, usually when I have these enormously long classes, I find that people want to stop and maybe have some coffee or eat or something. So why don't we come back at about 8:30-ish, let's say. You should be ready by then. And then we'll go on a little bit longer and then we'll stop because it is the first night. We don't have to go nuts. But so how about if we stop until about 8:30 or so? I'm going to pause the recording so that if you're watching it, you don't have a half an hour of dead time. And then when we get back, we'll carry on with this chapter 3. We'll get as far as we can before we are exhausted. And then we'll pick it up again on Thursday night. And then we'll finish this chapter and then we can get into the chapter that's about the Fed itself. All right, so let's do that. And so when we get back, let's say about 8:30, you should have had plenty of time to have caffeine and sugar and whatever you need to, get some stimulation going, and then we'll carry on from there. Okay? Excellent. All right.
this series. There are 405. The Knicks, 103. 103.
All right, I hope everybody's ready to roll. Okay, so I did mention here that by historical standards, an upward sloping yield curve is basically what we normally expect to see, but in recent years, hasn't really worked out this way. But there's a lot of reasons why the yield curve might be upward sloping. Basically, in a nutshell, what's happening here is that, and we'll see more of this later on in the bond chapter, longer term bonds are more sensitive to changes in interest rates than shorter term bonds. Okay. In other words, like the more cash flows a bond has, the further into the future the cash flows go, the more they're going to be impacted by the same change in interest rates. So this means that investors in longer term bonds are faced with a higher level of what's called interest rate risk than investors in shorter term bonds. So that is one reason. So for this reason, longer term investors require a higher interest rate or higher rate of return than shorter term investors. Okay, so that by itself is enough reason to explain why you would tend to see longer term bonds with higher interest rates or yields than shorter term bonds, but also just the mere fact that longer term bonds are more uncertain since their cash flows extend further into the future. So that, of course, means that they're riskier. Okay, so in other words, these are a couple of the main reasons why long-term bonds are often perceived as being riskier than shorter-term bonds. And so that being the case, as a result, the yields or returns to longer-term bonds tend to be higher, but not always, as we've seen, than for shorter terms. And so that's why, I mean, throughout most of US history, that's pretty much what we've expected to see. Um, a yield curve that's upward sloping, like this one. Okay, that's the norm. But when the circumstances are different, especially unusual cases like the COVID, for example, during the COVID, the yield curve was pretty much flat. I mean, basically, it was the same rate across all the maturities, as it mentions here. And so rates were very, very low because the Fed kept them there on purpose. And so you would expect to see, like, here's a graph that I found in the book. Right here at the bottom, this blue line is the COVID period, and it's pretty much flat. It's very low, it's very flat. 2017, it was kind of flat as well, but it was quite a bit higher rate. So times were much more normal in 2017 than in 2020. But then some of these, like this green one, is upward sloping. That was in 2013. 2019, it's a little bit upward sloping, not very steep, but it is upward sloping. And in 2023, it's actually somewhat downward sloping. So it just means that in those periods there was something unusual going on that offset a lot of this discussion here. In other words, yes, longer term bonds are still somewhat riskier than shorter term bonds, but other considerations cause yields to change their behavior. And in other words, during the COVID, nobody knew what to expect. And then during periods when inflation is unusually high, that also has a tendency to cause the yield curve to have a different shape. In fact, sometimes it can even be downward sloping. But in general, the curve itself can change over time very quickly and easily. And in fact, you can see, for example, here's a case where yield curve actually gets a little bit steeper. It shifts up and is steeper. And that often is caused by an increase in inflationary expectations. And then sometimes it goes the other way around. Sometimes it flattens out, especially when the economy is, at least people think it's heading towards a recession or something else unusual is happening. We also occasionally run into these international crises where something is going on in the bond markets throughout the world that's causing people to get very nervous. And so US treasuries are considered to be the safest in the world. So if people who own foreign bonds are becoming nervous, they may decide to sell those off and buy US treasuries. And when people do that, that causes their yields to drop. In other words, the safer the US treasuries are considered to be, the lower their yields should be. And so you often find that a flight to quality means that there's some international development that would lead the yield curve to do something like this in the United States. So, here's a perfect example from history. 1998 was an interesting year. This is, you might remember, Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s. And, eventually Boris Yeltsin became the president of Russia. Um, and so in 1998, during the presidency of Boris Yeltsin, I mean, Russia's economy was in pretty rough shape. I mean, as you can probably imagine. I mean, come on, it was a communist country. So you knew that things were going to be rough in Russia. So um, the the Russian economy was extremely weak. So here's what Yeltsin decided to do. The Soviet government had run up enormous debts with, that realistically were not going to be paid. It just wasn't going to happen. So here's what Yeltsin's up against. He's the Soviet Union is no longer it's now Russia, and but the economy is in really rough shape. They have all this debt left over from the Soviet days. So he basically said, listen, everyone, um, this was in August, if I remember correctly. Announced that now this is a very clever idea. Since the Soviet Union no longer existed, which is true, Russia was not responsible for the Soviet Union's debts. Well, so that means if you own any of this debt, he's basically telling you he's not going to pay you back. You're not going to get your money. Now, this triggered an enormous panic. What happened was investors took their money out of all third world countries. In other words, massive amounts of investments were withdrawn from all third world countries, not just the Soviet, Russia, and invested in the United States, specifically treasuries. In other words, imagine yourself owning bonds issued by these third world countries, and you figure, well, if Russia's not going to pay their debts, some of these other countries might not either. And so let's get our money out while we still can, and let's put it in something safe, meaning United States treasuries. And so as a result, yields in the United States dropped significantly. And this is what we call a flight to quality. People are taking their money out of risky bonds and putting them into safe bonds because of an event like this. And so because of that, the demand for US treasuries goes way up, the prices go up, and their yields go down. Okay, so that would have resulted in the yield curve flattening like this. Okay, now at the same time, and this is sort of a side note, there was a hedge fund. I'll just mention this story because it's kind of interesting, although it's not really related to this. But at this time, there was a hedge fund in the United States called Long-Term Capital Management, run by two Nobel Prize winners, that had invested in a strategy that would have only worked only if US yields had risen. So the fund lost hundreds of billions of dollars almost overnight and had to be bailed out by the Fed. So it was like these two guys won the Nobel Prize in 1997, and now here they are a year later, almost destroying the world's economy because they borrowed so much money to finance these investments that only were going to work if the yield curve actually went up. And instead, the opposite happened, and they couldn't get out of their trades fast enough to avoid just catastrophic losses. So basically, Alan Greenspan was the chairman at the time, and he essentially got together all the banks that had invested in long-term capital management and said, you know what, you're all going to share the pain. You're going to pay for this with your own money because we can't let the U.S. economy collapse. So it was quite a scandal, but it was caused ultimately by this Russian crisis, as it was called, where all of a sudden everyone's panicking. They're taking their money out of third world countries, investing in the US, and the yield curve is dropping. When these guys had placed massive bets that would go the other way around. So it was a very interesting point in history. And so now, of course, there's I think maybe a bit more oversight of what these hedge funds are actually doing. But yes, it was quite the time. But anyway, so investors are buying more US securities, treasury securities. The prices go up, okay, because the demand is increasing dramatically. And so as it turns out, and we'll see more of this in a later chapter, and this is really one of the more important concepts that we're going to learn this semester, is that there is an inverse relationship between the yields of bonds and their prices. So when their prices fall, yields rise and vice versa. We'll see why that is algebraically later on in chapter 8, I think it is. But it's an important idea that when people buy more bonds, the price goes up, but the interest rate or yield goes down further. So because imagine like the return, the amount of interest that you're getting paid with a bond is fixed. If the price goes up and you're paying a higher price for it, that's going to reduce the rate of return you're getting from owning that bond. While the dollar amount of interest is the same, it's the rate of return that's dropping. And so higher bond prices means lower rates of return. And so this is what's happening when the yield curve is dropping, it's because the prices are going up, and that means yields are falling. Okay. All right. Anyway, now, as far as interest rates are concerned, one of the big considerations is something called default risk. Now, except for the US Treasury, almost every other borrower in the economy, at least potentially, could run out of money and be unable to pay their bills on time. And that is known as default. Okay. So in other words, like I mentioned earlier, with municipal bonds, the city of Detroit defaulted on their debts. They were unable to pay them. They simply didn't have the money. The city of New York in 1976, same thing. They ran out of money. They could not pay the bondholders what they were promised. It happens infrequently with municipal bonds, and it has never happened with the United States government. But for corporations, it happens not all the time, but it does happen. In other words, you buy a bond issued by a corporation. If it goes bankrupt, well, guess what? You're not going to get the money you were promised. So default means that a borrower is unable to make the payments that they promised. So default risk or credit risk is a very important consideration in the determination of interest rates. In other words, why would an Apple bond, for example, have a lower coupon rate or interest rate than a much riskier corporation? This is the reason why. So default risk is a huge deal. Now, it turns out that there's an organization, there's actually more than one, called Standard & Poor's. There's actually a few of them. I only know 3 of them. There are 3 organizations that provide rankings or ratings for bonds based on their default risk. And their names are probably known to you: Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. There might be others, but those are the big boys, let's say. And so what happens is they provide ratings based on the creditworthiness of these corporate issuers, and governments too, for that matter. They do provide credit ratings for governments. And so the way it works is that they provide a series of letters, and in the Standard & Poor's system, at least, you also can get a plus or a minus. Okay, so they're kind of like grades. Okay, so we start with AAA, which is the safest. And you see, we work our way gradually down, double A plus, double A minus, all the way down. When we get down to triple B minus, we have an important dividing line here. These are all referred to as investment grade bonds because they're very safe. Anything below that is considered to be what's called a junk bond or speculative, meaning that they're relatively risky. And there's at least a chance that if you buy one of these bonds, you won't get the money that you were promised. Now, of course, the ones with the best ratings also offer the lowest interest payments. Of course, they would, because that's the way it works. It's just like, Bill Gates goes to the bank to borrow money. He's going to be offered a much lower rate of interest than you or I, because the chances of him running out of money are pretty slim. So, same thing with bonds. The interest that they offer you is going to depend on their credit rating. Low credit risk means high low interest payments and vice versa. So now, unfortunately, it's not easy to find these credit ratings on the internet. You typically have to pay for them, but there's a way you can get around that. You can look for announcements. For example, I'm looking for here it is. As recently as May 2025, it was announced in investing.com that Apple's bonds have a double A plus ratings. Okay, which means every so often what they do is they announce that they have decided that these ratings should stay where they are, or maybe they raise them, or sometimes they lower them. So according to this announcement, Apple at the moment is rated double A plus. Okay. Now you probably wonder, why isn't it triple A? Well, there must be some reason for that. I don't know exactly. It doesn't say here, but double A plus is the second best rating they have. If you want the actual ratings, you have to subscribe to Standard & Poor's. So we're not going to do that. It says here the company's supply chain is significantly exposed to China and to a lesser extent India and Vietnam. They're worried about tariffs, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so those are the reasons why it's not AAA. Okay. Let's see if we can think of somebody else that maybe that would be interesting. How about let's see if we can find Tesla. Now, Tesla is a very interesting company. It's, they're always involved with very, let's say, risky products. I mean, like robots and, electric cars and stuff like that. So self-driving cars. Oh, maybe. Yeah, it's not that easy to find this stuff. Oh, here. Oh, no, but that's 2015. Oh, maybe we have it here. I have no idea what that means. All right. Well, we'll figure that out later. Okay. Anyway, so that's how you know as an investor which bonds are the safest, by looking at their Standard & Poor's ratings or their ratings from the other companies. Now, if you're interested in buying bonds, you should buy national governments, let's say foreign governments, which you can do. They expose investors to something called sovereign risk. Now, a sovereign government can't actually go out of business, but they can run out of money. Argentina did exactly that in 2001. They had a massive amount of debt outstanding, and got to the point where in 2001 they had a major recession and they were unable to pay their debts. Now, what happens then? Well, in the international sector like this, what they usually do is renegotiate their debts with the bondholders. In other words, they say, listen, if you let us stretch out the payments for a few more years, we'll get you all the money that we were promised. So they're not saying, forget it, you're not getting any more money. But what they are saying is we have to change the terms of this bond so that we can pay it back maybe at a slower rate, or whatever the case may be. So this still leads to losses for investors, but not as much as, let's say, a domestic bankruptcy, where you might not get any of the money you were promised, or not very much of it. In fact, in the United States, a typical bond that goes bankrupt, the investor ends up returning maybe about 60% of their investment. It's not a huge amount. So with sovereign bonds, there's always a chance they may have to renegotiate the debts because they simply can't pay it. So that's something you don't get with domestic bonds, and something that has to be considered. But at the same time, though, Standard and Poor's and Moody's do have ratings for these different countries. In fact, I think it may be possible to get a list, at least for countries, without paying for it. Oh, here it is. Oh, it's on Wikipedia. No wonder. Wow. Oh, they got everybody here. Look at Argentina, triple C, even all these years later. That means don't buy their debt. I mean, God, can you imagine? Now here's Australia, triple A, of course, Austria. Now the United States, their deficits are getting pretty high. I think we're going to find that it's like double A minus or something like that. Double A plus. Okay, well, that's better. Um, some of these countries, Sweden and Switzerland, they're doing their triple A, Singapore. Oh, are there any shockers in here? Let's see, countries that you would never expect to be in trouble. Kuwait. Now that Kuwait, with all that oil wealth, they're still only at A plus. Japan's A plus. Yeah, because Japan has a lot of debt, surprising amount of debt. Um, Hong Kong is double A plus. Greece, has been on the verge of bankruptcy many, many times in the last 20 years, 30 years, whatever. Denmark is triple A. Wow. Hmm. All right. Anyway, so there they are, if you're interested. Now, by the way, the IMF, you probably heard of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It was established after World War II. And mainly what it does is it does a lot of things, but among other things, it helps third world countries that are up their eyeballs in debt. It helps them either renegotiate their debts, or sometimes it can provide them loans to help them get through tough times. Now, of course, all this money is coming from the United States, but the idea here is to prevent bankruptcies from among third world countries, and get them back on their feet if they're in trouble for some reason. So, like with Argentina, the IMF obviously had to get involved in renegotiating their debts to make sure that everyone got their money back eventually. Now, liquidity is an interesting idea. This is the ability to sell an asset in a hurry if you really need to. You probably can imagine that, like having, let's say, stocks and bonds are pretty liquid. You can sell them pretty quickly if you need to, but real estate is definitely not liquid. It takes a long time to sell real estate, and it involves a lot of expenses. So you wouldn't put all of your wealth in land, for example. You want to have some of your funds in liquid assets so that you can pay your bills, basically. So you might have a bunch of your money in stocks and bonds, and you might have a lot of it in checking accounts and savings accounts. But then you might also have some land and some other assets, maybe art or diamonds or whatever it happens to be. The thing about liquidity is assets that are very liquid typically provide very low rates of return. For example, savings accounts, checking accounts, etc. Assets that are less liquid can't easily be used to pay for expenses, but will offer significantly higher rates of return. For example, um, um, a classic example of this. Okay, so liquidity is a huge consideration. Now, treasuries are extremely liquid. If you have treasuries in your portfolio, you could sell them just like that, like immediately, almost immediately. But a lot of bonds, a lot of corporate bonds in particular, take a long time to sell them because there really aren't any buyers. Um, so, that's something that needs to be taken into account when deciding what to invest in. So let me just mention that here. Treasury bonds, extremely liquid. Most corporate bonds, in other words, it can take a great deal of time to find a buyer. Can So that's another one of the reasons why treasuries have such low rates of return, because they're so liquid, they're so convenient. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but you can actually buy treasuries directly on the treasury's website. You don't even have to bother with a broker. You can just go set up an account and you can buy them. Now, here's the bizarre part. You can actually now buy treasuries in denominations as low as $100. Okay, that's unthinkable in the bond market. Most bonds sell for at least $1,000. The Treasury wants to make it easy for you to invest in Treasury securities. All right. So, so because of that, um, they sell at a higher price, which means that their rates of return or yields are that much lower. Um, Taxes, they're actually treasuries are not subject to state taxes, and municipals are not taxed by the federal government or the state in which they're issued. So in other words, if you buy a municipal bond issued by New York City and you actually live in the city, you don't have to pay any federal, state, or local taxes on them. And that's one of the attractive features. But because of that, they also pay very low rates of return as well. So you're getting a low nominal return, but if you're in a very high tax bracket, it works out very well for you. Okay, because the taxes are like basically zero. So that's why they tend to be bought by high income investors. By the way, here's our first algebraic expression of it. We have an actual formula here. The after-tax yield of a bond equals the before tax times 1 minus t. T is our tax rate, which is a percentage. Okay, so it's that straightforward. So let's say, for example, we have a bond that has an 8% yield, and we're in the 30% tax bracket. The amount you actually get to keep is 5.6%. Okay, 30% gets taxed away, the rest stays with you, 5.6%. So now they're going to come up with this theoretical framework for determining what the different components are of a bond's yield or rate of return. And so it's going to start with the basic risk-free rate of interest, which is the yield on an equivalent treasury security. And then we're going to assume that investors are receiving a premium in the form of a higher return for bearing credit risk, liquidity risk, and tax adjustment risks. So what they're saying is that imagine that whatever the yield is on a bond, the minimum it can be is the same as a treasury security, because that's the safest in the economy. And then on top of that, you're being compensated for credit risk, liquidity risk, and for tax adjustments. Now, of course, it's hard to, it's in practice, it would be very difficult to separate these out from each other, but they're trying to get you to think about it in these terms. They're trying to explain to you why the yields are higher for bonds with terrible credit ratings, bonds that have very low liquidity levels, and the ones that are fully taxed, which is most of them are fully taxed. It's really only the municipal bonds and the treasuries that are, they give us preferential tax treatments. So yeah, here's a simple example. Like imagine that we've got a corporation rated A+ by Standard & Poor's, issued a 30-year bond. At the moment, if we look at the yield curve for treasuries, the 30-year yield is 2%. And there's a 1% credit premium for A+ bonds, which, Standard & Poor's has done all the research. Let's say they know that investors require an extra percent to hold an A+ bond compared with the equivalent treasury. And then there's a liquidity. Okay, so this bond, now by definition, no bonds are going to be as liquid as treasuries. So let's say that the premium required by investors for this liquidity is 0.5%. See, now this is a typo. This should have been double O. Oh boy. Oh, these are same problem, but it is 4% when you add them up. It's just that these should have been triple O, double O. All right, anyway, but then that means that the treasury is yielding 2%. This bond is yielding 4%. Okay, why? Because there's an extra percent for the credit premium, 0.5% for liquidity, and 0.5% for taxes. Okay, so that's the theoretical model that we're working with. I'm just going to make a note of this, that this needs to be fixed. Okay. Now, here they're going to give us these theoretical reasons behind the shape of the yield curve, the term structure of interest rates. So just remember that the pattern of interest rates or the securities, the bonds issued by U.S. Treasury, the pattern of yields and maturities. I guess what I should say is the relationship between yields and maturity is known as the term structure of interest rates. Okay, so when you look at the chart here, here it is. Okay. Right here, as of May 1st, these numbers would be defined as the term structure of interest rates. Now, if you notice, what's interesting is it dips down in the middle years, and then it goes back up again to 474. So not exactly a normal yield curve. In fact, wow, that's strange. It looks something like this. That's not normal. But we're not in normal times right now. So, it's to be expected. So these are the yields, and this is the maturity. And of course, it'll be different every day. If you were to go in here, if you copy this into Excel, I mean, you could create all these curves if you want and see how if you notice they're creeping up a little bit. In fact, on the 23rd, if you notice, these two went up over 5%. They mentioned that on the CNBC, actually. Right, 0.027. So the 10-year Treasury yield went up just a little bit, just a tiny amount. But that's usually perceived as a sign that investors are expecting higher rates in the future. And that would result from a few possibilities, like the economy heating up again, or maybe higher inflation. Okay. Now, this theory, this is a very popular one with economists called the pure expectations theory, is that the long-term rates are higher than the short-term rates because we expect rates to be higher in the future. Okay, in other words, in this theory, an upward sloping yield curve whoops, means that investors expect rates to be higher in the future. So in other words, we see a lot of this in economics. We're assuming that people's behavior is driven by what they expect to happen in the future. In other words, why do you buy stocks in the first place? Because you expect their prices to go up in the future. So if you expect rates to go up, if you buy a bond now and yields go up in the future, the price of your bond will go down. And so in order to buy that same bond, you have to be compensated with a higher yield today. And so that's why the curve is sloping up, because investors require that extra premium, I guess you could call it, in order to buy bonds that are potentially very risky. So, in other words, for investors to buy bonds today, it must be compensated risk. Bond prices will fall in the future as interest rates rise. Okay. Now, of course, it means the opposite if the yield curve is sloping down. Um, but expecting rates to drop usually means that they're at unusually high levels now. So a downward sloping curve, which is the unusual case. This often happens when interest rates are at unusually high levels. By historical standards, which could mean that inflation is unusually high. So this is often perceived as kind of a scary thing. To see a downward sloping yield curve is often seen as bad news. In other words, people are expecting something not good to happen in the future. So, or at least until recently, this was perceived as being kind of a negative indication of the future. Now, of course, sometimes the yield curve is flat, which it's kind of flat now. Like something like this, I mean, it would never be a straight line, but it could be relatively flat. That usually just means that investors expect rates to stay unchanged in the future. Mm. And you do run into that sometimes. Although sometimes it has little dips and little curves, but if it's more or less the same at both ends of the yield curve, then that means we're sort of in a holding pattern. We don't think there's going to be any changes in the future. So anyway, what they're building up to here is there's going to be several numerical examples here of strategies that investors can engage in based on their expectations. And this is going to take a while. So I think right about here is a good point to stop for tonight, at least, so we can pick it up again on Thursday. Now, I'm hoping that the mind tap will be ready by then, and when we can go over it and I can show you, how it works. And, because that's where the assignments are taken from. So, supposedly this problem is being worked on as we speak, but right now the mind tap's not available to you, so you can't go in there and start looking at the problems or the book. But unless something goes horribly wrong, I expect that to change by Thursday, and so I can go in and show you how this thing works, and and that way, you'll have the ability to work on the assignments. And also learn how the interface works and what you're expected to do. So hopefully that will get straightened out between now and Thursday. And if it does, we'll go over that first before we do anything else. Okay. So the first week's problems, I think, are based on just these first two chapters anyway. So we're in pretty good shape as far as that goes. So anyway, I guess now what I'm going to do is this version of the slides that I've been writing on, I'm going to post this on Brightspace along with the original one in case you want to go through it again. And then the recording, I'll be making that available as well. Okay, so in other words, if you missed something or anyone couldn't make it tonight, they can watch the recording on Brightspace. So other than that, I think we can knock it off here. And then on Thursday, like I said, I'm hoping that we can go over the mind tap and then we can get back into this chapter. And then from there, we'll carry on with chapter 4, which is our introduction to the Federal Reserve System. Okay. All right. So hopefully everyone's still hanging in there. It was a long session, especially at night, after work and blah, blah, blah. But, it's only a month or so, so we'll get this done. And then you'll have 3 credits in your on your transcript. And that's really what matters, right? All right. So I'll see you all on Thursday night then.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.